Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you all here. My name is David Lepofsky. I am the co-chair of the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee, a totally nonpartisan but broad-based coalition of individuals with disabilities and organizations concerned about the rights of persons with disabilities, which has come together in this province to advocate for a strong and effective Ontarians with Disabilities Act. I propose to speak for just a couple of brief moments, then to have each of the people up front here speak for, given that they're all, except for me, former or present politicians, something that is unusually brief. And I have beside me a white cane with a hook on the end of it, so that if anybody talks too long, we get to tell them to stop. I want to thank you all for coming out, and just to make a very brief statement. We've made history here today. We've made history here today because a year ago an election promise was made that had two vital elements. First, a party was elected on an election promise that it would, if elected, enact in its first term an Ontarians with Disabilities Act. It's a law we want so we can achieve a barrier-free society for people with disabilities in this province by the year 2000. The second important element of that promise was an unequivocal commitment to work together with the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee towards the end of developing that legislation. Neither elements of those promises have been acted upon to date. There is no Ontarians with Disabilities Act. There is no government promise of commitment since the election to act upon its promise before today. There has been no meeting with the government to discuss an Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Indeed, we've approached the Premier. He's told us he's too busy. He's told us to meet the Minister of Citizenship. We've approached the Minister of Citizenship. She's told us that she isn't ready to meet with us yet. After several approaches last fall, we've heard nothing since. We've also been advised of absolutely no policy work being done, either with us or alone by government, to live up to this promise. Put simply, it was a promise made on May 24th of 1995, but up until today, absolutely nothing has been done as far as we could tell to live up to it. So we came to the legislature today in great, incredible numbers for the purpose of resorting to what was a novel legislative tactic. We figured if we couldn't get a meeting, we couldn't get an answer from the Premier or the Minister, the very least we could do is appeal to the legislature in one collective voice to get together and to put pressure on the government to keep their promise. That has happened today by the resolution that was passed this morning. It happened unanimously. The government and the opposition, unified together, has called on the government to keep its promise. What we need now is action. We need a meeting with the Premier, who, while very busy, could certainly make a little bit of time now that the legislature in a unified voice have called on them to keep this promise. We need action, working together to develop this legislation. We need a bill introduced into the House as soon as possible. And we need the opportunity for all parties interested in this legislation and the opposition parties who have come together to unified with the government to support the idea of such legislation to get it passed and to get it passed soon. I'd like to suggest just one other point, and it's a really important point. The point is that what we have witnessed here today is really not one event, but two. And they're very ironic, these two events, because on the one hand, we got to see one of those usual parliamentary debates with mud or other such substances being happily hurled. I'm sure we all found it interesting, if not entertaining on occasion. Perhaps we didn't. But in any event, we got a piece of good news and we got a piece of bad news. And we have to, as people with disabilities, remember that we seem to get the two together. You see, the good news is that we came here in numbers and that the members of Parliament unified to support our request. But the bad news is that far too many of our numbers couldn't get in to see what was happening. The legislature is a place where democracy takes place. It is the core of location. It is the very heart of the process by which we as citizens have our voices heard. but for albeit dozens of people in wheelchairs who had choice of about 4 seats in the galleries, they had no opportunity to go in. They had to watch it on TV. They could have just as well stayed at home. If we need an example of a barrier in our society, if we need a symbol of how barrier-ridden our society is, if we need an example of why we need an Ontarians with Disabilities Act now, it is the example that was presented by my colleagues today who had to bring their own interpreters if they're deaf, who in wheelchairs, for the most part, couldn't even get into the legislative chamber that every citizen should be able to enter as a matter of fundamental right. So the good news is, we've got a legislative voice calling now for immediate action and no more delays. The bad news is, we had that call made in a building that itself symbolizes the society in which we live, a society with too many barriers. So, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to ask the members of the panel here to each briefly speak, more briefly than me, and then we'll open it to questions from our friends from the media who are here today. Do you want to go first?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Ian Scott, sitting to my right, to your left, and my use of those terms mean nothing about politics, is sitting with me. He is known to all of us as a senior and accomplished member of the bar, as a former Attorney General and a former member of the Legislative Assembly in this province, and as a leading citizen who has added his voice to ours in calling in a nonpartisan way for the prompt enactment of an Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Mr. Scott?
Yes. Ontario desperately needs new legislation to achieve a barrier-free society in Ontario with its persons with disabilities. An Ontario with Disabilities Act would make this province a far better place, both for its many citizens who have disabilities, those with many more disabilities, and as an Attorney General for Ontario for 5 years, I am proud to have brought forward with reasonable amendments. It's the Ontario Rights Code to help promote the goal of inequality for all persons with disabilities. However, we know that we still have a long way to go, and prompt government action is urgently needed.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, this is a party of former attorneys general. From one former attorney general to another, I'd like next to ask Ms. Marion Boyd, who's the courageous and heroic sponsor of this resolution, to speak for a moment or two about the vote we just achieved.
Thank you, David. Well, I'm very, very pleased to be here and to be here with my colleagues Ian Scott and Gary Malkowski, who in their own ways have contributed greatly to our being at this point today. I'd like to thank somebody else who's here. I didn't know she was going to be here, but Rami Walsh, who's sitting here, is the person who taught me about the barriers for disabled people. Rami came into the daycare center I was running as a 2.5-year-old, I think, Rami, And we discovered together how hard it is for us, with the best will in the world, to actually achieve integration for people. And when I was doing that work, I didn't know that I would have to cope with a disability myself, or that my daughter would end up having to cope with a disability like multiple sclerosis. And so I will be forever grateful to Rami that when we faced our own problems, we already had some of the knowledge that all of you have. I want to thank everyone who came out today. I know what kind of effort it takes. There are going to be a lot of tired people when today is over, and I hope that the energy that comes from having at least passed this resolution will make up for some of the hardships that you faced actually trying to come into my inaccessible workplace. So thank you for coming, and we really appreciate it. The next step, of course, is the hard one. A resolution is a resolution. Legislation, and legislation that is adequate and is passed is the next step. And all of us must continue to work together to recognize that disability is a nonpartisan issue. We have to be working with those who voted for this resolution on all sides of the House to ensure that adequate legislation comes forward. And I think we'll be successful if we keep working together, if we keep on bringing to the attention of the people of Ontario how much we all stand to gain when everyone's talent, everyone's energy, everyone's ingenuity can be brought to bear on the economy and the other problems that we have in this province. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to suggest next that we've invited each of the three political parties to send a person to speak for their party at this gathering. From the Liberal Party is Mr. Dominic Agostino.
Thank you very much, and certainly pleased on behalf of my caucus to be here today to support the initiative and the resolution that was introduced by Ms. Boyd in the House today, and widely supported. And I think that was said well earlier when the greatest symbol of the problem in this province is this building itself. And this is the building that symbolizes democracy in Ontario. This is the building that people from this province send their elected member to represent their views. But this is the same building that many Ontarians cannot get into and cannot access. And I think that along with this resolution today, that was widely supported, and it was nice to see that all three parties unanimously supported the bill. It is important for us to press quickly for the enactment of the bill itself, at the same time to press for even more immediate changes to this building itself, and to make sure that there's never, ever another time where people who want to come to the legislature, who want to see democracy in action live in person, are denied that right as a result of inaccessibility. So certainly commit, and I'm sure my colleagues here, on behalf of my own party, that we will do everything we can to bring that along. And I think it's important, as Mayor mentioned, the next step now is the government members. Clearly, the resolution means absolutely nothing unless the government and the minister and the premier are willing to act on it. And I urge you to keep the pressure. People who are in this province who are involved to keep the pressure on, to get to the MPPs, to get to the premier. This fight's only begun, and it will be won when the government finally decides that they're going to act on the wishes and the commitments that they've made. So thank you again, and thank you to Ms. Boyd, I think, for the leadership that she has shown in this issue, and certainly the great support that was demonstrated today.
Thank you very much. Now, I want to note that we wrote to the leaders of all three parties, including Premier Harris, asking if they would send someone to this press conference. I'm wondering, is there any elected representative from the Progressive Conservative Party here who would like to be able to speak about the resolution? I don't see anyone.
No.
I'd like then to express our regret that we've had to resort to a resolution, and our regret that no one is here from the government to speak about what they propose to do about it. I'd like finally, before I turn to questions, to introduce Gary Lepofsky, known to us all, a former member of this House from the NDP, the proud sponsor of the first private member's bill ever to bear the name Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which unfortunately died because an election came. and has worked closely together with us, and a close personal friend, Gary Lepofsky.
I'd like to thank everyone for being here. I think it's a very hard struggle that we have, and I think that this is a very important day. This is a recognition of the struggle we all have. And we know that the Harris government, with the cuts in services to people who are disabled, has been very harmful. And we know that he is just increasing the hardship and the struggle for every one of us. This resolution is one step in rectifying that. I would like to remind everyone that Mike Harris, as a premier, has a disabled son. And I am wondering how much he is listening to what his son has to say. I think it's very important for all of us to recognize that there are two important people who aren't present today. The Minister of Citizenship and the parliamentary assistant to the minister who is responsible for this issue. They are not present. They were not present in the House. They avoided the vote so that they would not be recorded. So we don't know what their thinking is on this issue. I think it's important that we continue to struggle until the government introduces a government bill relating to the Ontarians with disabilities and removing the old barriers and any present barriers that have been erected. It's important that the ODA Act be enacted because it benefits everyone, disabled as well as non-disabled people. And this is a common sense revolution. This is a cost-effective way of investing in Ontario and in bringing back all of those people who are disabled into the mainstream. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. Two quick points before taking questions. Number one, I'm not going to list the names, but I want to thank publicly all the volunteers who've helped us out today, who's helped get this organized, who've helped bring people in from out of town, who've helped make sure everybody knows about this event. They've done tremendous work, and special interest groups hire lobbyists and pay well-oiled, slick people. We run on volunteers, folks, and we're very much in their debt. I also want to note that all people who've come to this event today are encouraged on conclusion of this press conference, now that you're in the building somewhere, to go look for a door that has the name of an MP on it. Doesn't matter what the party is. Knock on the door, go in, meet the member of parliament or their staff, and ask what they're prepared to do to help make this resolution turn into action. You're here. Let's get on with it and see what we can do. Now, are there any questions from our friends from the media?
I have a question. What happens now with the resolution? Now that it's been passed, what happens?
That's entirely up to the government. If they do not bring forward the legislation that is called for in the resolution, there's very little that the opposition parties can do except to remind them that it was a unanimous resolution based on a promise made by the Premier. And we will continue to remind this government that in fact has happened, and to encourage them to talk to the experts in this field, the people who have come together to form the committee, and with their help to form legislation that will be useful and effective legislation.
Does procedurally or technically, does the resolution, does it have to be given to the appropriate minister, or does it just sit there now?
We don't have to worry about it because we're going to get a letter out very promptly to the Premier and the appropriate ministers, so we don't stand on technicalities. They will get it.
I expect they will hear about it this afternoon.
But in terms of procedure, nothing necessarily has to happen.
And we intend, as our first follow-up, because the resolution calls not only for the legislation, but for the government to work with us. It is the Premier who made the promise. It is the Premier who said he wanted to work together with us. We will be asking immediately for a meeting with the Premier to follow up on that.
Could you give a few examples of how enacting legislation like this could provide enhanced people's lives?
I'm certainly happy to. People take as an assumption, as a given, that our society is accessible to all, and if it's not, that people would go about fixing it. Unfortunately, that's not true. There are very many barriers in employment, physical barriers in terms of an inability to get in the building, attitudinal barriers in the case of employers who don't treat people with disabilities in many cases as being equals and able to perform effectively on the job, technical barriers, people buying computer technology that some people with disabilities might not be able to use. The same happens in our schools, our universities, Many of our universities are unable to accommodate all the needs of persons with disabilities or have indeed inaccessible classrooms and so on. Public transit is again the same, and we all are familiar with not only how inaccessible much of our public transit is in this province, but how the parallel transit to make up the gap has been cut. We're looking at legislation that will accomplish a change for this. And by the way, the only remedy you have now is go to the Human Rights Code, file a complaint, and wait 5 or whatever years to maybe get an individual remedy. And people with disabilities don't have the time, the energy, and the resources to spend forever litigating one barrier after the next. So our aim for this legislation is essentially has the following elements. First, we want the law to set as a goal, and there's one which everybody spoke in favor of, no matter what their political rhetoric, the achievement of a barrier-free society for people with disabilities by the year 2000. Secondly, it should include a stated right of all people with disabilities to fully participate in our society, for existing barriers to be removed consistent with timely goals and available resources, and to prevent the creation of new barriers. And the third element of such legislation, and we're ready to sit down and work on details if only somebody on the government side would be willing to give us the time to talk, is effective mechanisms that lets the old barriers be taken down, lets the new barriers be prevented in a cost-effective way, in a way that minimizes red tape, minimizes litigation, maximizes results. We've got lots of ideas of how to do that, and we feel that the effect of such activities will be not only to open up our society to all people with disabilities today, but to open it to those who are going to acquire disabilities between now and the year of 2000, who themselves don't have a disability now, but through aging and other causes will be getting them in this foreseeable future. It'll also open up our society to people, other able-bodied or temporarily able-bodied folks, who use baby strollers and can't get up steps and the like, or shopping carts and can't get into a lot of shopping facilities. This is good for business, it's good for us, it's good for everybody. Other questions? Tell me, journalists don't have questions?
No one else?
I'd like to ask a question concerning the definition of disability. One of the trends that has been taking place in the last half year has been an attempt to narrow the definition of disability. One of the strengths of the disability movement and the struggle for rights in this country has been a cross-disability basis of association. How is that going to be, how would you see that being addressed in forthcoming legislation?
Well, in developing such legislation, there are going to be a number of technical issues to roll up our sleeves and get to work on. That's why we don't want to wait till the year 1999 to talk about the barriers to remove by the year 2000. That's why we want to sit down and start talking to the government now. There are a number of technical and legal and policy issues on how to frame the definition of disabilities in the Ontarians with Disabilities Act. There's one definition of disability in welfare laws. There's another one in the Human Rights Code. There was still another one in the now repealed Employment Equity Act, and so on. We need to craft a definition which is as inclusive as possible and which achieves the goals that we're setting for ourselves. And again, we're ready to roll up our sleeves and get to work on that, but we're sitting at a table which is empty at the other side.
Do you have a draft act?
We don't have a current draft act. The Gary Lepofsky introduced a private member's bill a couple of years ago, which made it through second reading but died on the order paper. It was an excellent basis for preliminary discussion, but we appreciate very much Gary's leadership in introducing it. But it was never intended to be the first and final word on this matter. A private member's bill, as many of you may know, can't spend money or allocate resources, so it was significantly limited that way. And it was not the product of, it was the product of one private member doing what he could, rather than what we'd like, which is to sit down with a premier and a government to apply the resources they have and to consult with us so we can develop details. So while it's of use historically in the evolving process here, we don't necessarily consider its text to be sort of the Ten Commandments or anything like that.
What sort of model do you conceive? Something akin to pay equity that places, or like the legislature would have to set kind of plans?
There's a number of different ideas, and we have not limited ourselves as to, we've got a range of ideas we'd like to table with the government. We may well have more ideas once they're ready to talk to us. We expect that they may come up with ideas. We want to look at what's gone on in other jurisdictions. Let me give you an example of the kind of thing that we just, as one example, might want to consider. Let's say a person with a disability wants to use an automatic teller machine at a trust company. Banks are federal, trust companies are provincial. If you roll up to it in a wheelchair and can't reach, you got to file a human rights complaint about that machine at that branch. If you're blind and they've got one of those awful new touch screens that nobody can use, sighted or blind, or your reaction speed isn't such that you can react in a nanosecond before the screen changes, you've got to file a human rights complaint because they don't accommodate us. You've got to wait years. And then you've got to file another one against another bank, and so on and so on. And you've got to litigate. We prefer legislation to litigation. What we'd like to be able to do is to identify, have the disability community identify an area where there's serious barriers, like automatic teller machines, and to sit down with the whole trust company industry, not in a lawsuit, but in a legislative discussion, and say, all right, here's what our needs are. Why don't we set a timetable by which teller machines will be accessible? Let's say the new ones will be made accessible within the next year, the old ones will be retrofitted within a certain prescribed time, and let the government hear both sides and broker a regulation that sets standards, targets, and timetables that we can all live with. That saves us all filing human rights complaints. It saves one unfortunate trust company from the cost of having to litigate for 5 years, and it lets the government try to come up with realistic standards that will be achieved consistent with the resources that the industry has. That, to us, makes sense, just as an example. Now, we're not wedded to that or any other particular example, but we can, it's just one illustration of how smart regulating will get us more equality, save the public money, and minimize regulation. And we would have thought that that would fit within the agenda of any government, whatever be their political stripe.
One other question, and it's to Ms. Boyd, really, I guess. I never understood why your government didn't adopt Mr. Lepofsky's bill 168 and pass it. Then we would all be spared this, what we're doing today.
Well, we made a different decision. We made a decision to go ahead with two major pieces of legislation under the auspices of the Minister of Citizenship, the Advocacy Act and the Employment Equity Act. Very practical positions that we felt needed to move the yardsticks in those two areas faster than any others. And that's simply the problem with a very crowded legislative agenda. As you know, it took us a long time to get those two acts into place, get them proclaimed, and get them going because of all the issues involved. One of the problems we've got in a legislative period of time that is as relatively short as ours is in Ontario is that it takes a long time to develop appropriate legislation, particularly if you're doing appropriate consultation. It took us a long time on both of those acts. We thought they needed to come first, and that this kind of an act was a natural follow-up to it and would have come in the second term.
I guess, I know hindsight, of course, is wonderfully perfect, but since this seems to be a less contentious act, it would seem that it would have been one that you could have done relatively easily. And as Mr. Baird pointed out in the legislature, you didn't sit a whole lot in the last year. You could have sat a few more days, maybe.
Well, you can make that comment if you like. I mean, basically, we were busy getting the Employment Equity and the Advocacy Act into place, and that was really a huge undertaking. And it is really very disappointing to us to see that huge undertaking and all the dollars spent on that simply wiped out with one flick of a Tory pen.
I'll say that for the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee, we have been and remain to be nonpartisan. We love anyone who supports us, and we make a delicate amount. Believe it or not, we are. We will be critical of anyone who doesn't support us, and we will try to persuade them. And at this point, we are happy, whatever be the history that's gone by, that we have three parties in this House who have not only all signed on to the goal of this legislation, but have voted in support of the resolution for this legislation. So there is no partisan political reason why the legislation can't go forward and can't go forward fast.
But Mr. Lepofsky, you heard the politicians in there today, and you made a joke about it earlier. It didn't sound very nonpartisan in the House today. Are you convinced that despite this resolution, something will actually get passed?
I don't make predictions. My foresight is about as good as my eyesight. We undoubtedly have, listen, we would have been happier if the Premier had made the promise and if he or his ministers would have met with us a year ago. We would have been happy not to have to resort to this tactic. We are very realistic that this kind of novel legislative pressure is unfortunate. It was a last resort. We are hoping that this will break some of the logjam. It will signal to the government that this is a higher priority than they seem to think it is, and frankly, that contrary to what may be their expectation, we're not going away. And therefore, we don't have any. We have the passionate hope that the promise will be kept. We have the passionate hope that we will be able to get a strong and effective Ontarians with Disabilities Act in place, and we intend to work very hard to keep up the pressure to that end. If you want to know what predictions I'll make, ask me after the legislative term is over, and I'll tell you if they passed it or not.
You've mentioned you brought a lot of folks in from far-flung regions. Could you just tell me who's here from where, how many?
I don't have a count. Some people are in this room, some are in other rooms. I know there was a bus from Hamilton. Is anybody here from London? We got a bunch of folks from London. We got the word out, reminding everyone that because we're a volunteer nonprofit and being supported by nonprofit volunteer organizations, we got the word out, and it was a spontaneous combustion that brought people here. We didn't have people signing in. I frankly don't know how many were here, but all I do know is there were a heck of a lot of people here. And the feedback we're getting from Toronto, we've organized in Ottawa, we're going to be organizing shortly in Hamilton, we've got plans for elsewhere. This is not a small little group, this is a across-the-board sort of bunch of people. Other questions?
Yes, I'd like to go back a bit to the definition of...
By the way, I'm terrible with faces. Can you maybe tell me your name?
Yeah, I'm Bill McQueen from the Disability Network at
Right.
CBC Television.
Thank you.
I'm interested in exploring something that's been of considerable concern to me, which is it seems as if in all of the cuts and the various problems that have arisen, that there has been a division insinuated within the disability community between persons who are severely disabled and persons who are not severely disabled. And that attaching that to the issue of cuts of economic austerity and so on, how will the Ontarians with Disabilities Act clarify once and for all this matter of who is disabled and how it is the society should treat persons with disabilities by the year of 2000?
Okay, let me answer by saying this. People with disabilities in this province cover all ages. There's 15% or more of the population. They've got a whole mess of problems. We've been hearing about them during the debates, and we've heard about them elsewhere. The Ontarians with Disabilities Act is aimed at addressing one segment of those problems, which are the barriers that we face in accessing and will face in accessing major opportunities like employment, public transit, education, goods, services, and facilities. That is one set of problems, and we intend to focus on that and for all people with disabilities. It will not, however, address a number of other areas of pressing concern which others within the community are also working on. In other words, this isn't a panacea for everyone, so that if there are issues of income maintenance, issues of health care and the like, those are very important issues, protecting vulnerable persons and the like. Those are all initiatives which are ongoing. We're dealing with one slice of the difficulties facing people with disabilities. We hope to move forward on that, but we also hope that our colleagues will also be moving forward on those other issues. And we will not, and one of the things that I've found both delightful and exciting, and I'm sure all the people with disabilities who come here today are happy to say, is that whether they're blind and they're interested in access to things in Braille, or they're deaf and interested in sign interpreters, or people using wheelchairs who are concerned about ramps, they have come together in a unified voice, more unified than ever before, because they all want to see progress on this. Okay, let me just see if we could take one more question, and I understand people have to leave. Is there one last question people want to take? No. All right, well, thank you all very much for coming. Feel free to go visit your MPs. Feel free to go visit other people's MPs. And have a great day, and thank you all.